culture is much more important than politics. Let's just start getting people living the way they want to live. You want to live in a world where you don't have to work? Let's make it. You want to live in a world where you can get food for free? Let's make it. You want to live in a house with, lots of women and men and live the way you want? Let's do it.
Free people, the San Francisco Diggers. Freedom has always been a stereotype and staple of American culture, but there's one social movement in American history that pushed ideologies and enactments of freedom more so than they had ever been pushed, and wouldn't you know it, it happened during the 60s. A rambunctious and visionary street performer group of anarchists who called themselves the Diggers essentially gave up personal property, creating a model for what a free society at large would look like. They openly rejected the current American way as oppressive and inadequate for human development, creating their own alternate route instead. They had a philosophy of freedom not only for goods and services, but also for the mind, body, and soul, shown in their practices of life acting and existence within a psychedelic community, the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. Although their movement was relatively short-lived and eventually fizzled away after 2 or 3 years, the achievements of the San Francisco Diggers were revolutionary when considering their goals and their long-term effects on American culture in general. Original San Francisco Digger members came from the San Francisco Mime Troupe, founded by R.G. Davis, who wanted to bridge the psychedelic community with the political New Left, whom were both thriving in the San Francisco Bay Area. The troupe performed in public parks for free, exploring intense themes that were overtly political and mainly aimed to confront hypocrisy in society, hopefully expanding the consciousness of the audience. There was exploration of horizontal oppression, biracial relationships, and even a minstrel show. Davis's intention was to use the art of theater to create social change in the community. His formula to do so worked as a trinity: teach, direct towards change, and exemplify change. That is, until they were challenged by the fuzz on grounds of obscenity. After this run-in with the police, many members decided to break off from the mime troupe to practice their own way of enacting Davis's tactics. Manifesting as the Diggers, they sought to fuse their art and reality as one, taking their acting outside of the traditional performance space and into the streets. By constantly acting and therefore living the vision of freeness, they demonstrated that it was possible. This incarnation of leading by example, life acting, was fueled by the combination of 3 theories. Antonin Artaud's theater of cruelty, in which the artist assaults the senses of their audience to allow them to experience their unexplored subconscious feelings. Bertolt Brecht's epic theater, or theater of alienation, in which the audience is made to feel removed from the characters as opposed to sympathetic for them, and start to critically evaluate them, resulting in deep reflection about one's own life. And finally, Wilhelm Reich's general theories of sexual liberation, and that most problems within individuals' lives can be traced back to sexual or socioeconomic issues. These ideologies, when mashed together, inform that Digger method of life acting was, as said by Charles Perry, not merely the central art form, but the key to spiritual, psychological, and political salvation. Like many others in the Haight-Ashbury, the Diggers shared the same general feeling that society was pretty lame, oppressive, inhibiting, and playing out in a generally meaningless cycle of archaic practices. Their visceral experience of life acting was attractive to many, simply because it proposed a liberated existence for oneself and a meaningful vision to pursue one's community. Becoming a life actor was a way for the Diggers to cure themselves and their peers of the drags of American society. They enticed audiences to embrace the theatricality of life and exposed them to their anti-property ideas of freedom in the process. The inspiration behind the name and some facets of the political practices of the Diggers came from a group of English agrarian communists who, in 1649, developed or dug land to sustain themselves during a time of economic hardship. Both generations of Diggers aim for a reworking of the relationship between social and economic practices in effort to sustain their communities, and also use evocative pamphlets and other socially present direct appeal methods to reach their audience. Everything is free was the later Diggers' version of the original Diggers' disregard for the construct of personal property and served as the inspiration for some of their early and most well-known feats, such as the daily free food giveaways, free crash pads, and the free store, which represented a mockery of capitalism and provided free resources for the Hashberry community. This free existence and philosophy empowered and enabled the Diggers to do virtually anything they saw fit for the purpose of revolution. To avoid the system, they would gather whatever the community had to offer for free, sometimes through mysterious means, sometimes through purchase, and distribute it to the public. Digger events encouraged crowd participation and discouraged mere spectation. They wanted you to be involved and cast away the precious understanding you had of society and decide to live outside of its rules and boundaries. Much of their events were, after all, protests aiming to congest the throngs of tourists and cars that had come to stare at the hippies after the counterculture started to gain media exposure. All Digger-run events and even institutions were essentially just life-acting performances. To get to the free food distribution, for example, crowds usually had to walk through the free frame of reference, a giant yellow 13-foot-tall rectangle, which also was the name of the first free store, which represented the re-evaluation of one's perspective. LSD was also largely involved in the whole hate scene, and the general theatricality and self-reflection that goes with the psychedelic crowd meshed well with the trippy nature of the Diggers' methods. The drug money that flowed around the Hashberry also helped fund many free activities. Dealers and musicians were widely attributed with being top contributors, in addition to their already quintessential contributions of music and drugs. The post-war economic boom the country was experiencing also assisted the Diggers' acquisition of goods that were fortunately in abundance. Diggers were mostly successful in avoiding police and gaining public support from other young hippies with their intriguing and safeguarding sheath of anonymity, in addition to their radical example of non-exclusivity, telling people who asked if they were Diggers, "You're a Digger," and proposing that anyone who asked to see the management of the free store be told, "You are the manager." The free systems of the Diggers were largely successful in providing for the hip community until the population explosion of miners and drifters who started flooding into the Haight during 1967. They responded to the influx of young wannabe hippies with events such as Death of the Hippie, Birth of Free Man, a funeral for the hippie identity, and a celebration of the liberated individual in effort to portray a different vision to newcomers. But as the summer came, more people crammed into the Haight-Ashbury, and the neighborhood became a complete mess. To respond to this, the Diggers tried to acquire lands in the surrounding countryside areas to help create safe havens for people to outsource to. The Digger activities became less and less frequent as more Diggers left, and the scene of the Haight grew more unstable. Eventually, the Diggers gave away their final possession, their name, as it was becoming loosely used and became instead the Free City Collective, an effort to start providing for the communes that had popped up all around the Bay Area on the model of a collective self-sufficient system where all goods and services were provided by participating parties. The San Francisco Diggers were not necessarily reaching out to the populations outside their immediate community unless it was for collaboration such as other radical or anarchist groups like the Black Panthers or the Hells Angels. But they effectively served their own hip community, while also creating a reality of literal and metaphorical freedom for themselves, completely casting away traditional ideas of capitalism and conservative, complacent American ways of the 1950s. In today's society, where everything can be bought and sold, and most oppressive institutions and norms revolve around and operate within the monetary system, the thought of a group of people finding ways to make everything free, including themselves, sometimes just as a testament to their own freedom, however outlandish it may have been, the Diggers showed an admirable desire to better society while allowing themselves to be creative during the process. They went where no one has gone before in contemporary American culture, casting away their socioeconomic privileges and creating their own institutions and practices purely with all the resources that already existed in the world around them. Trickle-down examples of accepted freedoms can be found all across contemporary American society, like apps, hugs, internet-based platforms, etc. Additionally, American youth of today revel in the multitude of personal freedoms that mainstream culture has come to accept. Tattoos, music tastes, different fashion styles, even the atmosphere of a music festival culture is widely accepted. Much like the original Diggers, the San Francisco Diggers were indeed a short movement, only being active from roughly 1967 to 1968. But they also had a huge realm of influence for their size and status. Not only successful in terms of achieving goals that shifted within the community, the Diggers were the living example of the one thing that drove them the most: freedom.